The village does not hear a warning siren first. It hears the mountain coming apart. It is the morning of 21st October 1966 in Aberfan, South Wales. The valley is cold, wet, and ordinary in the way fatal mornings often are. Children sit in classrooms at Pantglas Junior School. Coal miners are already at work. Mist clings to the slopes above the village, softening the outline of the waste tips that have stood there so long they almost pass for part of the landscape. Then the ground above them gives way. More than 100,000 cubic meters of saturated colliery spoil break loose from Tip 7 and begin to move downhill as a black, liquefied mass. What looks solid on the hillside turns fluid under pressure. Water trapped inside the waste strips it of strength. Gravity does the rest. The sound is not one sound. It is a roar, a grinding collapse, and the deep tearing noise of earth and industrial waste losing all restraint at once. The slide gathers speed as it descends, swallowing fences, cutting through the slope, carrying stone, slurry, coal waste, and debris in one moving wall. It strikes a farmhouse first, then it drives onward into the heart of the village. It destroys houses. It smashes into Pantglas Junior School with such force that classrooms disappear beneath black sludge, broken timber, shattered brick, and choking dust. Children die where they sit. Teachers die beside them. There is no meaningful time to run. There is almost no time to understand. Men come up from the pit and run toward the school, still wearing their work clothes, their faces marked by coal dust, their bodies already exhausted from labor underground. They dig with shovels, with boards, with bare hands. The slurry grips everything. It fills mouths, lungs, corridors, and stairwells. The smell is wet earth, coal, burst water mains, and pulverized masonry. Then comes the silence that always follows violent destruction, and it is worse than the noise. It is the silence of a village waiting to learn how many of its children are still missing. By the end, 144 people are dead, including 116 children and 28 adults. 18 houses are destroyed. A school is buried beneath the waste of the industry that feeds the valley. This is not a natural tragedy. This is a preventable disaster. This is the story of a community buried by the black spoil piled above it. The black hills above Aberfan do not rise there by nature. They are built load by load, shift by shift, by an industry that takes coal from beneath the valley and leaves its waste above the people who live in it. Merthyr Vale Colliery exists because Britain demands coal in enormous quantities for more than a century. Coal heats homes, drives factories, powers railways, feeds steelworks, and anchors whole regional economies. In mining valleys across South Wales, the pit is not just a workplace. It is the center of wages, time, housing, transport, and survival. Aberfan grows in the shadow of that economy. Families depend on the colliery. Shops depend on miners' pay packets. The village breathes in the rhythm of the shift whistle. By 1966, Merthyr Vale still employs hundreds of men and produces well over 200,000 tons of coal in a single year. That output brings profit and fuel, but it also creates a second material stream: spoil. Or rock, shale, ash, slurry, and low-value waste come up with the coal, and all of it has to go somewhere. At first, waste is tipped on available ground lower down, but industry expands faster than safe planning. As the easy dumping space disappears, the spoil is taken uphill and stacked above the village in vast black mounds. They look inert from a distance. In rain and fog, they seem almost natural, like dark extensions of the mountain. They are nothing of the kind. They are industrial residue piled by decision. Each load is small in itself. Together, they become towering man-made landforms, holding the discarded weight of decades. This is the central bargain of coal country. The pit gives employment, but it also rearranges the landscape around working people without asking whether that landscape remains safe. The men underground do not choose where the waste goes. The families below the tips do not sign off on drainage plans, slope stability, or the siting of spoil above a school. They inherit the hazard because they need the wages. Risk becomes ordinary through repetition. A black hill is seen every day, and so it stops being seen at all. If this kind of industrial history matters to you, subscribe now, because these disasters do not begin at the moment of collapse. They begin years earlier, in habits, shortcuts, and accepted dangers that harden into routine. And on the slope above Aberfan, that routine is already building something unstable. The deadliest industrial systems are often the ones that appear most settled. They stand in plain sight for years, dark and silent, until the day their stillness proves false. Above Aberfan, the spoil tips seem fixed into the mountain. They are black against the Welsh rain, streaked with runoff, dull under fog, familiar to the eye. Men pass them. Children grow up beneath them. From the village floor they look heavy, permanent, almost geological. But these hills are not natural ground. They are accumulations of waste from Merthyr Vale colliery, broken rock, shale, coal residue, ash, and fine slurry pushed upward and outward over time. By 1966, 7 tips stand above the village. Together they hold an immense mass of discarded material. Tip 7, the one that finally breaks, rises high above homes and schoolrooms, its surface shaped not by engineering discipline, but by repeated dumping. That distinction matters. A properly engineered embankment is designed with drainage, compaction, slope control, and an understanding of how water moves through the ground. A spoil tip like this grows by routine. Waste is brought up from the mine, carried to the edge, and tipped. Another load follows, then another. Shift after shift, the heap enlarges. Its apparent solidity comes from weight and habit, not from real stability. The outer face can look firm while the inside remains loose, layered, and vulnerable to saturation. Fine material mixed with water can lose strength quickly. What appears to be a hill can behave, under pressure, more like a loaded fluid. The system also rewards continuity. Coal extraction does not pause simply because waste disposal becomes dangerous. The pit keeps producing. The spoil keeps rising. Stopping to redesign disposal costs time, money, and output. So the tip is treated as part of the routine infrastructure of the mine, something ugly but manageable, something that has stood long enough to be trusted. That is how deceptive calm settles over industrial risk. No explosion is visible, no flame, no smoke, only dark spoil, rain, low cloud, and the faint vibration of a working valley carrying on with its day. The workers closest to the system do not control its design. They see the heaps. They work beneath them and around them. They live in the consequence of decisions made elsewhere. And above them, inside that ordinary-looking black mass, the real danger is already taking shape where almost nobody can see it, in the water moving through the ground. The most dangerous part of the hillside cannot be seen from the village below. It moves in silence, beneath the spoil, or through the ground itself. Above Aberfan, the black tip does not sit on dry, dead earth. It rests over natural springs and water-bearing ground. That fact matters more than the height of the waste or the darkness of its surface. Spoil can look firm from the outside and still be failing within. When rain falls hard and repeatedly, water works downward through loose waste, filling the spaces between particles, adding weight, removing friction, and weakening the structure from the inside. A heap of coal waste is never just a heap if water is allowed to live inside it. It becomes unstable mass, held together by habit, not safety. By October 1966, the weather has already done its work. Heavy rain saturates the slope. The black surface softens. The upper section of Tip 7 begins to sink. Workers on the tip notice it early, or rails buckle into the spoil. Ground that should remain level begins to deform underfoot. There is no dramatic explosion, no fireball, no single mechanical failure loud enough to force action. There is only movement in wet waste, the kind of slow warning industrial systems are trained to endure rather than obey. That is what makes it so dangerous. A violent threat announces itself. A buried one asks to be ignored. The villagers do not know the full geology above their homes, but they know the signs of danger in the only language working communities are usually allowed: complaint, observation, repetition. There have already been earlier slips on the mountain. There have been concerns raised about slurry and drainage. Residents have spoken. Local authorities have written letters. Meetings have taken place. Nothing equal to the risk follows. The springs remain beneath the tip. The waste remains above the school. The workers closest to the slope are trapped inside a chain of limited power. They can see subsidence. They can report it. They can feel the wet softness under boots, smell the cold earth, hear the dull shift of unstable ground under machinery. But they do not control where the tip is placed, how drainage is engineered, or whether production habits are stopped before people die. That authority sits elsewhere, higher up, further away, protected by procedure. If you think a mapped spring, repeated movement, and ignored complaint already form the shape of guilt, leave that judgment in the comments. And Aberfan is not the first place where a warning is mistaken for an inconvenience. Aberfan is remembered because the dead are so many and so young. But the mechanism that kills them is not new. That is part of what makes the disaster so grave. The mountain does not invent a new form of violence on October 21st, 1966. It repeats one that industry has already been warned about. The warning signs are written into the history of the very slope above the village. At Aberfan itself, spoil has already slipped before. There is a significant movement in 1944. There is another in 1963. These earlier failures do not produce the same body count, so they are absorbed into routine memory as troublesome episodes rather than proof of a deadly system. Men notice. Officials note it down. Work continues. That is how industrial negligence often survives, not by denying every warning, but by shrinking each one until it seems local, temporary, and manageable. The pattern extends beyond one Welsh hillside. On across the coal fields, spoil tips fail where loose waste, steep gradients, and water are allowed to coexist. Later technical review identifies 18 rapid colliery spoil failures between 1898 and 1966. That number matters. It shows geographic spread. It shows repetition across decades. It shows that unstable waste heaps are not freak events. They belong to a known class of preventable industrial hazards. The names of every site are less important than the shape of the warning itself. Tipped waste, placed without sufficient drainage, water moving invisibly through loose material, earlier slips treated as isolated, an engineering concern pushed aside by the need to keep extraction moving. This is the deeper failure of the system. Each incident is compartmentalized. A slip here is blamed on weather. A slip there is blamed on ground conditions. Another is folded into paperwork, stripped of urgency, and left behind as one more technical inconvenience. The industry learns the wrong lesson from survival. Because one movement does not yet bury a school, it is taken as evidence that the system can continue. Because one village escapes mass death, the next village is left exposed. The workers living beneath these tips do not mistake the hills for harmless scenery. They understand rain. They understand soft ground, drainage ditches, black runoff, and the dull fear that comes when spoil shifts under weather. But they do not control policy. They do not choose whether earlier failures trigger redesign, relocation, or closure. Those decisions sit with managers, engineers, boards, and institutions that keep treating each warning as a separate event instead of a single accumulating indictment. By the time Aberfan is buried, the pattern is already old. The next question is not whether the danger exists. It is how ordinary families come to live directly beneath it. The waste tip is not distant from daily life in Aberfan. It stands over it. That is what gives this village its particular kind of dread. Industrial danger is not fenced away from the community, but suspended above kitchens, schoolyards, chapel roofs, and rows of terraced homes. By 1966, Aberfan is a mining village of roughly 5,000 people, and the colliery is still the center of its economic life. Merthyr Vale employs hundreds of men. Their wages feed households, pay rent, buy school clothes, and keep local shops alive. The rhythm of the village follows the rhythm of the pit. Boots leave early on wet mornings. Coal dust settles into fabric, into skin, into the creases of hands. Men return exhausted from underground heat, from the vibration of machinery, from the smell of oil, metal, damp stone, and worked earth. Above them, the spoil tips remain where the eye can always find them, black against low cloud, streaked by runoff after rain. That constant presence changes how danger is understood. Familiarity wears down alarm. A threat seen every day stops announcing itself. The hills of waste become part of the background, like the winding gear, the railway, the wash of soot on masonry. Children walk to school beneath them. Families hang washing beneath them. Windows look out at them. This is not because the people of Aberfan fail to understand risk. It is because working communities are made to live inside arrangements they do not control. The same industry that offers employment also decides where the spoil goes, how high it rises, and what level of danger is considered acceptable for those living below. 12-hour shifts, long commutes to and from the pithead, damp weather, and economic dependence leave little room for ordinary people to challenge technical authority. A laboring family cannot redraw a slope or drain a spring. They can complain, observe, worry, and carry on because wages are necessary and moving away is not simple. That is how risk becomes normalized. It is folded into routine until it feels less like a threat than a condition of life. So the village lives in two worlds at once, one domestic, intimate, and ordinary, the other industrial, unstable, and imposed from above. The children in the schoolrooms, the mothers in the houses, the miners below ground, all exist beneath the same burden. And then, on one wet October morning, that burden begins to move. At 9:15 in the morning, the hillside above Aberfan stops pretending to be a hill. It becomes a moving body of industrial waste, and from that moment onward, almost nobody in its path has time to save themselves. The collapse begins high on tip 7 after days of heavy rain and hours of visible subsidence. The spoil is already saturated. What should remain a piled mass of waste has been weakened from within by water moving through loose material and buried springs beneath it. Then the structure gives way. The upper section breaks loose and turns into a fast-moving slurry of coal waste, shale, mud, and water. This is the technical horror at the center of the disaster. Once spoil becomes waterlogged enough, it can lose the friction that keeps it in place. It no longer behaves like a stable mound. It behaves like a black avalanche. The sound reaches the village before the shape does. It is a roar, then a grinding surge, then the deeper concussion of a mountain of waste tearing itself free. In the fog and low cloud, many do not see the mass clearly at first. They hear it. They feel the vibration underfoot. Then it comes through the slope, down over the hillside, smashing the farm buildings at Nantigros and killing those inside. It crosses the disused canal, bursts a water main, gathers more liquid force, and keeps going. By the time it reaches Aberfan, it is not just spoil. It is spoil mixed with water, earth, broken infrastructure, and speed. Pantglas Junior School has only just begun the day. Children are in their classrooms. Pens are out. Exercise books are open. Teachers are at the front of the room or moving between desks. Then the slurry strikes. It hits the school with immense force, blowing through walls, collapsing masonry, driving black waste into corridors and classrooms in seconds. Windows shatter. Timber snaps. Brick and glass vanish into moving sludge. Dust fills the air. Then the mud takes over, thick, cold, and suffocating. There is no orderly evacuation, no practiced route to safety. The destruction is too sudden, too heavy, too complete. The colliery hooter sounds around 9:20. Men come up from underground and run toward the school still in work clothes, with coal dust on their skin and the smell of oil and damp earth still on them. And some have been laboring in heat below ground only minutes earlier. Now they are clawing through sludge with shovels, planks, hands, anything they can seize. Fathers dig for children. Neighbors dig for neighbors. Teachers, rescuers, miners, and townspeople work inside a silence broken only by shouted names, shifting rubble, and the wet drag of spoil being cleared away. There is no heroism that cancels what happens here. There is only helplessness, labor, and the unbearable speed with which ordinary life is destroyed. And when the first shock passes, the scale of what has been buried begins to reveal itself. The destruction does not end where the slurry first strikes. It spreads outward through the village, through walls and roads and buried utility lines, turning one collapse on a hillside into a wider field of ruin. By the time the waste reaches Aberfan Road, it has traveled with crushing force for hundreds of meters. The first blow falls on Pantglas Junior School and the houses nearest the slope. But the violence does not stay neatly contained there. 18 homes are destroyed or left uninhabitable. Part of the secondary school is damaged. Streets vanish under black spoil. Windows implode. Doors are torn from frames. Garden walls collapse into sludge. The disused canal is overwhelmed. A water main is ruptured, adding more liquid weight to a mass already made unstable by saturation. What begins as a failure of tipped waste becomes a moving mixture of mud, rock, coal slurry, masonry, timber, pipework, and household debris. That is why containment is impossible once the slide begins. A saturated spoil tip does not behave like a pile of loose stones rolling downhill. It behaves more like a dense, fast-moving flow, carrying solid material inside liquid force. As it accelerates, it picks up whatever the village places in its path. Brick becomes shrapnel. Timber becomes battering ram. Glass becomes invisible hazard in black mud. Every struck structure contributes to the destruction of the next. For the people inside the village, the disaster arrives in layers. First comes the roar and the vibration underfoot, then the impact. then the choking dust and flying fragments, then the sudden black weight settling into streets and rooms where people have lived ordinary lives only minutes earlier. The smell is wet coal, burst water, broken drains, fresh mortar, and cold earth pulled violently out of place. Rescuers move through unstable ground that can still shift beneath them. They do not know where voids remain, where walls may collapse, or where more bodies lie under the spoil. They dig anyway. This is where industrial negligence reveals its full reach. The danger is not confined to the point where the tip fails. It moves through public space, domestic space, and the social body of the village itself. A preventable disaster on the slope becomes a chain of destruction below it, and every additional meter of travel widens the circle of grief. When the slurry finally stops moving, the village is left to count not just where it struck, but who it has taken. When the movement stops, the counting begins. That is when the full cruelty of the disaster comes into view, not as a mass on a hillside, but as names, ages, desks left empty, and homes that will never return to what they were that morning. The final death toll is 144. Of those dead, 116 are children. 28 are adults. Most of the children are inside Pantgla Junior School when the slurry hits, and many die where they have been sitting only moments earlier in classrooms still arranged for an ordinary autumn day. Exercise books, coats, lunch tins, broken timber, shattered brick, and black spoil are pressed together into one suffocating ruin. 5 teachers die with their pupils. In a village of this size, such loss does not strike one street or one family alone. It tears through the whole community at once. Nearly every household knows someone who is missing, buried, or dead. Recovery is slow, physical, and intimate. Men who have spent years working underground now dig through wet waste above ground, searching not for coal but for children. They work with shovels, boards, ropes, and bare hands. The spoil is heavy, cold, adhesive. It grips clothing, skin, tools, and rubble. It fills pockets in collapsed rooms and settles over bodies with such force that rescue quickly gives way to retrieval. Some victims are recovered soon. Others are found later, after hope has already thinned into dread. The silence between shouted names becomes its own form of suffering. The human toll is not measured only in the dead. It remains in the parents waiting outside the school, soaked by rain and slurry, listening for news that grows worse by the hour. It remains in the miners forced to identify children they have known since birth. It remains in houses where siblings return but brothers do not, where a chair at the table is suddenly permanent evidence of absence. A village built around labor is wounded at its center because the next generation has been buried beneath industrial waste. The grief is therefore more than private. It becomes civic, communal, almost geographic. Aberfan is not merely bereaved, it is altered in structure, memory, and future. Half a generation is gone, and the valley has to live with what that means. Then the investigators arrive, and the language of responsibility begins its careful work. The truth is not buried for long. The dead are buried. The responsibility is found in plain language, on paper, in public, and still the system protects itself. In the aftermath of Aberfan, the official inquiry does not struggle to identify what has happened. It does not describe a mystery, a freak collapse, or some unknowable failure hidden in the mountain. It finds that the National Coal Board is responsible. The tip has been placed over known springs. Earlier slips have already occurred. Warnings have existed. Complaints have been raised. The report cuts through the evasions and states, in substance and tone, that this is a preventable disaster born from incompetence, neglect, and the absence of proper policy. The language is cold because the facts require no embellishment. Waste has been tipped above a village without adequate understanding of drainage, slope stability, or the danger posed by water moving through loose spoil. A school has been buried beneath it. The chain of failure is technical, administrative, and moral at the same time. That technical failure is not difficult to grasp. A spoil tip placed on water-bearing ground demands strict control, drainage, inspection, and engineering judgment. Without those, rain does not remain weather. It becomes load, pressure, and movement inside the mass. But even after the disaster, the focus of response narrows in familiar ways. Immediate causes are easier to name than the structure that permits them. A spring, a slip, a local failure, a lapse in judgment. These are real, but they are not the whole truth. The whole truth is a disposal system allowed to operate without sufficient safeguards because stopping it would interfere with routine, authority, and cost. For the workers and families of Aberfan, this official recognition brings a brutal kind of clarity. They are not imagining the negligence. They are not exaggerating the danger that has hung over them. The record now says what grief already knows, yet public condemnation does not become equal punishment. The officials and institutions linked to the failure do not face consequences proportionate to 144 deaths. Careers bend less than lives have been broken. Authority absorbs shame and carries on. This is the quiet second injury of industrial disaster. First, a system kills. Then it explains itself with just enough honesty to preserve legitimacy while avoiding true reckoning. The report is damning, but the structure survives. The people below the tip have paid in bodies. The people above them in hierarchy pay in embarrassment, and that leaves the hardest question still standing. If the cause is known so clearly, why does this kind of preventable disaster keep happening at all? Preventable disasters do not repeat because nobody understands the danger. They repeat because the danger is understood, measured against cost, and too often tolerated. That is the hard truth beneath Aberfan and beneath so many industrial graves like it. A spoil tip does not become deadly in a single morning. It becomes deadly over years of accepted practice. Waste is taken from the mine, lifted upward, and tipped where it is most convenient. Water is known to be present. Earlier movement is known to have occurred. Complaints are known. Small failures are known. Yet the system continues because stopping it carries its own price in money, delay, authority, and output. Safety asks for redesign, drainage, surveying, inspection, and sometimes the one thing industry resists most, interruption. Production asks to keep going. In that contest, working people are usually the ones forced to live beneath the decision. The technical logic is simple enough. Loose spoil placed on unstable or water-bearing ground is not a passive heap. Rain enters it. Springs feed it from below. Fine particles lose strength when saturated. Weight increases. Friction drops. A slope that appears settled can begin to move from the inside long before collapse becomes visible from outside. None of this belongs to mystery. It belongs to engineering, planning, and enforcement. When those are weak, habit steps in, and habit is treated as proof. The tip stood yesterday, so it is assumed to stand tomorrow. That false confidence is one of the most lethal habits in industrial history. Workers do not write the disposal policy. They do not decide whether warnings become formal action. They do not control how much money is spent on drainage, monitoring, or relocation. They labor inside a structure built by managers, boards, regulators, and economic pressure. They are close enough to feel vibration under boots, to smell wet earth and coal waste after rain, to see black runoff and subtle settlement, but too far from authority to force change. Their power is proximity without control. That imbalance is why this kind of disaster keeps happening. Institutions normalize risk when risk is profitable, familiar, and politically easy to hide inside technical language. Deaths are mourned afterward, but the acceptance begins long before in the quiet decision that danger is cheaper to manage than to remove. Leave your judgment in the comments. Where does the real failure begin? On the slope? In the office? In the missing law? Or in the culture that treats casualties as tolerable overhead? And once that question is asked honestly, only one final reckoning remains: what the dead leave behind, and whether the living learn anything worthy of them. The dead do not leave behind closure. They leave behind a measure. Every law passed afterward, every inspection regime, every technical reform is measured against the fact that none of it arrives in time for the children and adults buried at Aberfan. In the years after the disaster, change does come. New rules are created for the management, inspection, and stability of mine and quarry tips. What has been treated too casually before is forced into the language of formal duty. Drainage, siting, monitoring, and responsibility can no longer be left to custom, assumption, or vague internal practice. That matters. It matters because spoil is not harmless once it is piled high above homes and schools. It matters because water moving through waste is not a minor technical inconvenience but a deadly force if ignored. And it matters because Aberfan proves, in the most brutal way possible, that industrial residue does not stop being dangerous simply because it is out of sight of the people making decisions. But reform is not the same thing as justice. The village still has to live with absence. Classrooms remain missing voices. Streets remain marked by memory. Parents grow older without the children they buried. The valley carries on, but it carries on altered. That is part of the legacy, too. Not only what law learns, but what grief preserves. Working communities remember disaster with a precision institutions often lack. They remember the smell of wet coal and broken masonry. They remember the roar, the choking dust, the black slurry, the silence afterward. They remember who was lost, and they remember how preventable the loss was. This is the lasting lesson Aberfan leaves to any age that places efficiency above human safety. Waste does not disappear because a ledger treats it as external. Danger does not become acceptable because it is familiar. A slope above a village is never just a slope when industry has loaded it with consequence. The argument is always the same. Production must continue. Costs must be controlled. Routine must be maintained. And then, one day, the routine breaks and innocent people pay the bill with their lives. Remember Aberfan not as a symbol, but as a community of workers, families, teachers, and children killed by preventable negligence. If you value documentaries that keep faith with labor, memory, and the dead, stay with this channel, because the ruins industry leaves behind are never only in the ground, they remain in the living.